Hello, everyone, and welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and I'm glad you're here with me today for episode number 312. In just a moment, I will share an interview I did with Zenith Virago from Byron Bay, Australia, who is one of the true pioneers of the death doula and home funeral movement, though she refers to herself as a deathwalker, a term that I really love and have come to appreciate. So I just had an amazing conversation with Zenith, and I'm excited to share that with you. But I have a couple of announcements first. First, I'm going to be offering a 2-hour workshop on surviving the aftermath of suicide. This will take place on September 9th. That's a Thursday, at 1 p.m. Pacific, which I'm scheduling it at that time to try to make it available for people in other countries. And it will take place over Zoom. There's a $20 charge to participate, and there will be time for discussion and questions and answers. So I hope you'll join me for that. I will leave a link in the show notes if you'd like to register for it. Starting now, the tickets became available just today. So you can just come to the show notes at EOLUpodcast.com, look for episode number 312, and there you'll find a link to sign up if you'd like to join me in that workshop. And the second announcement I have is to extend my gratitude to Elaine McDonald and Bruce Wad, who are new patrons on my Patreon page at patreon.com/EOLU. And to also let you know, I have finally posted another episode of Two Doctors and a Movie as one of the bonuses that you get for signing up for Patreon. My husband and I finally recorded a movie review, and we have another one all ready to go that we'll be recording soon within the next week. So we're getting that started again. And then every month I record the End of Life news update, where I go through all the news articles I can find on what's happening in the end of life arena. I curate those for you and give you just little summaries of kind of what's going on in the world. So that's posted every month as a bonus for my supporters. And one more thing regarding my Patreon page, it's now possible to make an annual donation rather than monthly donations. Some people would rather pay all of it up front on a one-time basis. And if you make an annual donation, it includes a 16% discount over the monthly level. So that's available whatever you choose, whatever works best for you. Thanks again to all of my supporters on that page on Patreon. Your contributions make a huge difference for me. So now we'll move on to my interview with Zenith Virago. And as always, stay tuned after the interview, and I'll come back with a few takeaways and to say goodbye. So here we go. Today, I'm so very happy to welcome my special guest, Zenith Virago, who is someone I've been following for years, ever since I first got interested in end-of-life issues. So it's a huge honor for me today to be able to sit down and have a conversation with Zenith. And I'll tell you a little more about her for any of you who are not familiar with her. She is a respected pioneer and acknowledged expert in the fields of holistic death and dying. With over 20 years' experience, she provides comfort, information, and guidance to assist us through the natural and the sacred, the inner and the outer journeying as we come to the transition at the end of our life. Zenith is the founding member of the nonprofit Natural Death Care Center and the co-author of the book Intimacy of Death and Dying. Her work is featured in the documentary film Zen and the Art of Dying, which is how I became acquainted with Zen in the first place. And she recently gave a TEDx talk in Byron Bay titled Disrupting Death, A Guide to Dying Well. You can learn more about Zenith and her work at her website is zenithvirago.com, but also naturaldeathcarecenter.org, center spelled CENTRE.org. and she's in Australia, so you can tell by the spelling. And I will leave links to both of those in the show notes for this episode. So Zen, thank you so very much for being here with me today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Well, I'm so excited to learn from you and talk with you and share our experiences and wisdom throughout the years. And I was hoping you'd begin by just taking us all the way back to the beginning, so many years ago, when you truly, as a pioneer, became interested in working with people at the end of life and became a deathwalker, as you describe yourself. Would you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it certainly wasn't something I was looking at doing with my life, nor did I feel that I had a calling, unlike lots of other people that I meet now. It was just simply responding. A friend of mine died suddenly in the garden. I went with her husband to the hospital to identify her body. She was the first dead person I'd seen. And I had a sort of an amazing experience with her body where I sort of just really felt her spirit leave her body. And as we were leaving the building, I said to her husband, we could do this ourselves. I'm sure we don't have to give her to strangers. We can work it out. Do you want me to do that? And that's what happened. And from there, it just really has had a life of its own, where people asked me if I would assist them, people whose family or friends had died, people who were dying. And gradually it's become, I just really describe myself as a community resource, where people who have those questions that they want answered or are looking for a different way from mainstream to do something. And I have just been assisting them legally and socially and, emotionally. But really what I see over and over again is how capable people are when they've got the right information and they've got caring guidance that wants to empower them to have the very best experience they can, whether they're the dying person or the accompanying family. And so the term Deathwalker for me is about walking that journey with those people, accompanying them, but not doing it all for them.
And it's interesting, Zen, because you really called upon, it was really just your own intuitive guidance, I would think, after the death of your friend, to have a sense that we can do this ourselves. And so it sounds like that's what you help awaken in other people who want to care for their loved ones at the end of life, is this deep inner knowing that we have about death and dying. It's actually the most human thing there is about us, the fact that we will die one day.
Yes, it's the only thing we have all in common. But it is, I really believe, and I believed it at the beginning, and my work has only affirmed that everyone has the inherent capacity to do death well. And that is one of my guiding principles in the work that I do with people. And I speak to a lot of people on the phone that I never meet. And, people are just looking for clear, concise, honest, non-biased, not profit-driven information, because it's like me, I knew it was possible. And fortunately, I found someone who could give me the information I was asking for. And so I'm bound by his example to me. So if anybody asks me for anything, I give it. Because you never know what that person's going to do with it. And you have to trust that it will grow that person and that experience for everyone involved.
Because it does seem that more people could be caring for their loved ones at the time of death and after death if they, as you said, if they had the right information and also felt they had permission or encouragement and support to do that. And it's such a valuable and worthwhile experience. It seems such a loss to me that some people do not get to take part in it.
And it's, what I find is that so I feel that my work is about accompanying people to die well and to have a healthier bereavement. So what I see is the more that people participate in the way they want to be involved and the more they actually accomplish themselves, the healthier their bereavement and the sense of loss. So I'm usually describing people as bereaved people rather than grieving people, because what I see is that a lot of people don't go into a deep grief. They come to terms with that loss while they're in it. And the ceremony itself also plays a massive part in that healing journey. And so for people who are participating in the death, or if it's a sudden death, then in how they have access to that body, what they do with it, how they address that ceremony, and the guidance that you can give people for sudden death also makes this massive difference to how they enter their bereavement and how they live on after that death. And because I live in a community, I'm continually bumping into those people year after year. And it's so obvious that the more they're involved, the better the quality of their life after that person has died.
And I know you started this work before there was even an internet. And so I assume your work truly was community-based and word just spread from person to person that you were someone they could go to for help. And it seems like what a different world it was back in those days.
It was. And I think that the thing we have to remember is that there was always someone in every community who held the birth knowledge from women to birth, and someone who held the death knowledge in order to accompany people at that time, whether that was a slow expected death or a sudden death. And so it's a traditional role, and it's only relatively recently in the big scheme of humanity that there has been a funeral industry, and that experience has been taken out of people's hands by the medical industry and the funeral industry, and especially in America, because you have probably the most developed medical industry in the world. You know, at least in other places we have, like the healthcare system in England and here is free to access. So for people, it's very expensive to die in America, which just is bamboozling for people anywhere else in the world where those services are offered free.
Oh, it's so true. So very true. And I was looking back at over all of these years that you've been helping people at the end of life. It seems that so much has changed, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on what has changed. But probably also there are things that haven't changed at all. Perhaps the fact that we all die and that maybe there's some similarities in death, no matter what else is happening in the world. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, I remember when I'm in my 60s now, and when I was a child, old people got ill. People said, oh, they were dying, and then they died. But what happens now for elderly people is with the medical intervention, there's this sort of stop-start process with people where you think they're dying, but then they recover. And I spoke to someone yesterday he's the same age as me. His wife has dementia. She's at the same age, in her 60s, earlier onset dementia. And we talked about how really he's already lost her, but her body is still alive, but her spirit, her mind, her personality are all gone. And just how painful that is to accompany someone in a living death. And so that ability to keep the body alive is very different now. The same with, I feel like I'm jumping all over the place, but anyway, I'll just say it because it may touch different people in different places. But the same, for miscarriage, when I was young and we miscarried, then the general attitude was, oh, it was probably best for the baby because there was probably something wrong, and and that was good. And people went with that. They felt it, but they got on with it. And it wasn't such a devastating experience, unless, of course, it was multiple miscarriage. Then that would be very painful. But we've got this sort of, I don't want to say denial, but this, we don't want to accept that death is coming and that it's a natural part of our lives. And we need to really do the work while we're alive in order to prepare for our death. And a lot of people now are very busy projecting that out onto others. But if you are looking at doing this work, you really have to do your own work first. You have to sit with the possibility that your children might die, your grandchildren might die, and how that is for you. And I think until you can sit with that comfortably, obviously you don't want it to happen, but to allow that possibility to come in, to work with that, then you really are not going to be the best service you can be to others, and to be able to sit in that discomfort.
That's such a good point. And, as a medical doctor myself and who's worked in hospice, I've seen it over and over again, even in hospice, that some hospice workers have not really contemplated their own death. And it feels as if they focus on the deaths of others so that they don't have to look at their own mortality. But certainly that is rampant throughout all of our medical system here, that doctors do not contemplate their own death, and therefore they are not good at guiding and helping people navigate through end-of-life decisions.
And because doctors unfortunately seem to see death as a failure, apart from palliative care or hospice doctors, as you have in the States. And that, the repercussions of that for people who are very trusting in doctors and their knowledge, and of course, most of the time that works well. It's the best it can be. But around death and dying, it doesn't serve us to invest in a system that sees death as a failure. And what I am fortunate enough to see here is, and elsewhere, is lots of people who are stepping away from that and just really thinking, what's the right thing for me? I don't want to have extended life with no quality. And it's so incredibly humbling to sit with courageous people who are dying well and taking their families with them in that journey, so that everybody can have the most honest and open and satisfying experience that they can, so that they can live on without that person in their lives, but knowing that they got the most out of that experience.
Yes, and Zen, you were mentioning that your schedule is quite busy now, and I was wondering if you have been seeing over the last few years more and more people becoming aware of death and accepting of death and wanting to look at that.
Yeah, I do. And I feel like there was a first wave with people like Ram Dass, Kubler-Ross, Joan Halifax, people like that who were groundbreaking and, bringing that, really waking people up to that. And then there was a second wave, which people like me, probably people like you when you became a doctor, but we were scattered pre-internet. We were all over the world just doing our thing, knowing that there will be other people out there, like Jerry Grace Lyons in the States, and there were other people. But now there's a third wave behind us that is full of young people like we were young in our 30s. And we're now all connected by the internet, so we all know who each other are and what we're doing. And it feels to me that that third wave of awareness and empowerment and adventure and excitement and reclaiming death into our own hands is unstoppable. And so for every one person that steps onto that wave, they impact on lots of people. And so now's a great time, actually, to be dying, because it's much easier to find that support and that guidance, that death is not a failure. And there are people willing to walk that with you. But at the same time, then there's this massive doula movement, which is sort of great. But exactly what you're saying about some of the hospice doctors, it's really not about, it's about being able to sit in that suffering and not trying to fix it, but to be with it and offer what you can, but have respect for that person's journey and see a bigger picture that how that person dies will be how they've lived. And, a lot of people are moving into that field without, like we said before, without doing their own work and without bringing a grounding and an acceptance of suffering. It's okay, sometimes people have to suffer, and sometimes it's terrible. It's not all nice. It can't all have a nice ending. It can be painful and distressing, and families can be in disarray or in conflict. And, and you have to move in that without trying to fix it all.
That's very well said and very wise, because I sometimes think that when we hear practitioners talk about being burned out, that what has really happened is that they have been overwhelmed by suffering because they have never learned how to sit with it and how to accept the inevitability of it.
And not to look for meaning. That was one of the great things that I learned quite early on was, if you're a family member, then by all means look for meaning in that, because you're coming from an intimate familial experience of knowing that person's life. But for people like me who are invited into that experience at the end of life, I don't look for meaning. I'm in it. I'm present to what is. I offer what I can. I accompany whoever needs that. I'm responding, but I'm also not trying to fix it and not trying to solve things. But so generally you could say that people will die as they've lived. But sometimes they have an epiphany or a revelation or something that they have been repressing for their whole life in order to behave in an acceptable way or a way that works for that family. They will rebel against their own life and their own conditioning. And often you can create a relationship with that person that is so beneficial to everyone involved, because just by your very presence there, it allows them to behave in a way to their family that disrupts that dynamic. But what I see a lot is that people are very seduced by the profound. And so birth and death are, incredible gateways into the profound, not into the mundane, which is what we're living most of the time. But like everyone wants to be at the birth of a baby, and the same can often be said where people are clamoring to be at the bedside of someone who's dying, because you really know you're alive when someone else is dying. And also it's an opportunity that people don't want to miss, but you have to really unpack why you don't want to miss that, and why your need to be there, to be with those people. And I think that's very true for doulas that are moving into that field now, to really, examine their motivation and, again, to do their work. And I think that I mean, I haven't actually said this in an interview before, but I feel that, there really needs to be personal, and people need to hold each other to account, in that doula world that's coming. That's why I've never described myself as a doula. I think it's great that people are exploring more about death, and great that people want to accompany people in that. But with that, you must do your own work.
You're so right about that. I so agree with that. And one of the things in your TED Talk, you talked about 8 lessons that you learned, and I'm going to jump ahead because you just mentioned don't look for meaning as one of those lessons. And also included in that is letting go of hope and being willing to sit with not knowing. And I think sometimes, well, I know this is true for doctors. Doctors know so much that they believe that they know everything they need to know, and sometimes fail to appreciate not knowing. But I think that could possibly happen to us the more educated we get about death and dying. We may not recognize that dying is a time of mystery when we can't possibly know everything.
Yeah. And that's also, that's what happened for me, where I found myself falling more and more in love with the mystery and the not knowing. And from that, I then thought, the more I look for meaning, and it's so easy to make meaning out of that situation or put an overlay on it. But I've found that everybody has their own truth. People can make assumptions and draw conclusions, different conclusions out of the same situation. And I just learned that the more I didn't look for the meaning, the more I just opened to the mystery and the not knowing, especially when I was working with families where someone had killed themselves. And because you never know what someone else is thinking. And you also, it can be something tiny. It can look like something that's led to that, but it may well be something else. And I started to learn because of the same stories that were being told. But I was also in a situation where I had to honor the family, but I also had to honor the person who died. And I was as the celebrant, or as the person assisting those people to organize that funeral, or to seek guidance in a moment where they were in shock, then putting my overlay onto that of meaning or what looked obvious wasn't actually helpful for them, and it wasn't my place to do that. And so I found myself quite quickly able to sit in the not knowing and just to offer it up, and to just accept what it was without trying to make meaning, which I think as human beings we try to do that all the time.
Oh, you're so exactly right. And I don't know if you know, in my history, my father died by suicide a number of years ago, which is how I first got started working in hospice and learning about end-of-life issues. So you're exactly right. As I look back, my mother had her story about why my dad died that way. My brother had a different story. My father's friends had a different story. And I know that it was a coping mechanism because in the moment, at the time, it was overwhelming, the confusion and to not understand what has happened. But I will say gradually over all of this time, I too have come to appreciate the mystery of it and to be actually comfortable carrying that mystery with me and not knowing or understanding, but still having great compassion and love for my dad in the moment.
Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible experience. And one of the things I've also done in the last maybe 12 years is I've dissolved the word suicide out of my language. So when because I don't think it's helpful to healing. it's become such an overused word. And what it actually means is to kill oneself. We're just saying that in a different language. We're saying it in Latin, I think. And as a transitional phrase, I would say that they have ended their own life because it brought a respect to the decision that that person had made, whether I agreed with it, whether I was devastated by it or not affected by it. But I felt that the families I was working with at the kitchen table and then at the ceremony, the more I used that, the more they started to see that's what had happened, because suicide now is so overused, it's sort of also become a meaningless word in a way. And after about 8 years of using that phrase, I just started to call it what it was. So now at ceremony and at the kitchen table and in interviews like this, I just generally say that someone has killed themselves. And because it's also, killing oneself is very different to dying. The outcome is the same, but when someone makes an action, either on their own person or to someone else, if they kill someone else, then that we need to acknowledge that in order to move into how we feel about that. And so the acknowledgement that someone has killed themselves or been killed, if it's a murder or an accident, I think really starts to assist people as soon as they can to be in their healing process, in their acceptance of that. And using the phrase suicide for a long time seems to prolong that limbo-y period before people can start to drop into an acceptance and a living with that loss in a more easy and comfortable way. And I've watched that in my own personal experience with people. And I find that when I make that statement at the kitchen table, so soon after the death has occurred, or in ceremony, people don't gasp. They don't say, oh, Zen, that's a bit harsh, or they move with it because they know it's the reality of what's happened. And they trust that if I'm saying that I'm using that language for their best interests, because sometimes it doesn't affect me, sometimes it does. But I'm finding that, and that's part of what I'm teaching to people, is about how we use language in a more thoughtful and responsible way.
Wow, that's such a good point, and something I had never really thought about, the word suicide, but I understand exactly what you're saying, because as I hear you use the phrase, he killed himself, there's something so honest about that, that statement, and so authentic. And it does acknowledge the intentionality. It does acknowledge the fact that my father made that choice, and that was his decision, as you said, to end his life. And so you're right that the word suicide in some ways is almost like putting a cover over it so that we don't look directly at the truth of it. And it's not very helpful.
It's not helpful to healing, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, this brings me to another one of the lessons that you mentioned in your TED Talk that comes up in my mind, which is you said every death has an equation, which I love that. I love thinking of it that way. And so every death is different because there's an equation around it. And I was hoping you would talk more about that for our listeners.
Sure. So again, after years of working in that experience, because often people would say, oh, I'm good with death, and then something would happen and they will be blown apart by that. So I just started to see that every death had an equation. So it's who the person is, how they live, and how they die, plus who you are, your relationship to that person, and your familiarity with death will give you a response. And that response will be different every time because the parts of the equation are different every time. And I think that's a very helpful understanding for people to see that, you know, they're not going to have the same response every time. And I just had it in my own life. You know, a dear friend of mine killed herself 2 years ago. And even with all my work, with all the deaths, people killing themselves that I've experienced as a celebrant, as a worker, I went to the deepest expansion of love for her, and also that her suffering was over. And it became very clear. I knew that intellectually, that when people kill themselves, they don't want to cause suffering to others. They just want to end their own suffering, generally. And I realized that I wouldn't wish that suffering on anybody, even someone I didn't like, never mind someone that I loved. And if that person had made that action in order to end that, then I'm bound to honor and accept that. And of course, that equation then is very different when it's someone who's lived a long life. They've had it on their own terms. They're dying slowly. They're able to do everything they want to do and say in that dying. And people have participated in that. So then their response will be much gentler, and they won't necessarily go into a grief response. They'll go into a sadness. And so we need to see that response can involve grief, it can involve sadness, and it can involve joy. And a lot of people, when you ask them, have experienced that when someone's died, they felt a joy arising, a spontaneous joy. But often they can't say that to people because other people don't understand, or they culturally it's not appropriate. So they just blanket that down. But fortunately for me, people share with me a lot of things that they're not sharing in public, maybe because it's too uncomfortable for others, but because I'm just able to be with everything, people share things that have made my work much richer and those insights much deeper.
And it does seem like as we accept the mystery of death, it makes it easier to understand this equation that you're talking about, and that therefore every death experience is different. Every experience of loss is different, so that we can begin to allow space for other people to simply have their own honest reaction.
That's right.
I did interview a young woman whose partner died, who had that experience of feeling joy at the time of death, but had been shamed by a number of people for saying that, as if there was something abnormal or wrong about that.
Yeah, which is terrible. And I feel that part of my work is to, share that, wake people up to that possibility, so they're not so harsh on other people, or people can just be with what. And I know from discussing with so many people, or what people write after I do a podcast, is to say, oh, thank you for acknowledging that, because I don't have to feel that there was something wrong with me, because it's a very common response. And it's about expanding. Love is very expansive. It can also be very contracting, like how we love our children more than anything else in the world, and we contract because we want to protect them if they're in danger. And so, but in one of its aspects, it's very expansive, and death offers us that expansion. But often, as you would know, as most people know, with every expansion, there's often a contraction. But if you can stay in that expanded state, which familiarity and practice can assist you to do that, then your learning is much more. I'm finding my learning as I age, with that openness, with that expansion, is greater. I feel more, I see more, and I'm able to be with people in a deeper way. And often I don't actually have to do anything, but my presence for them in that state is very comforting. It's like a big resource for them that they tap into and supports them. It's like a battery or a reservoir that can fill them back up when their emotions are draining.
And it seems also when you're fully present for people in that way without any expectations or judgments, you can simply be there with them. You're also creating a feeling of safety for them in a sense, as if a safe place where they can experience whatever is happening for them in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I often describe it. I see them as people in white water, in a choppy sea or a choppy river. And I feel like often I am a solid life raft for them to just take rest. They have to be in that choppy sea because it's their life and that's their experience in that moment. But to have respite care or something solid and present to hang on to for a while, to fill yourself back up with as you get thrown back into that tumult of responses and to that death, because it's not only the emotions, it's all the practical things that you have to sort out when someone dies. It's so consuming, and often people are looking for some sort of something solid when everything else is up in the air or awash. And so I just find to see it like, and you see it at a ceremony where the family are swamped by other people's distress, especially when children die, that it's everyone's worst nightmare. But sometimes the family themselves are sort of okay because it's happening to them and they are dealing with that in the best way they can, whereas everyone else is consumed by their fear that that could happen to their children and how it will be for them. And it's like watching people drowning in other people's distress, a projected distress. And that's very hard to watch for people whose experience is already overwhelming. Yeah.
Oh, it just points out so much the importance of having a guide during that time who's able to just to be there and be like the life raft or for something for people to hold on to give them a little bit of solid ground here and there.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing that I can't wait to talk to you about also that you mentioned in the TEDx talk is that if you could only ask one question of patients, if they're only capable of answering one question, you would ask them, what do you think will happen when you die? And so I'd love to hear you discuss that more and answers that you hear to that question when you ask it.
Yeah. So I do. Because some people are very tired and don't have much energy when I meet them, and sometimes people are very alive even though they're dying. And I find over and over again that the answer to that question is always interesting, and sometimes it's surprising, but it's very sustaining. So whatever the answer is for that person, it honors their particular belief and how they're coming to terms with their body dying and whatever they believe. So some people will have religious beliefs, others will just have a spiritual belief. Some people believe that when the body dies, that's it, nothing lives on. But my experience over 30 years is that most people believe something leaves the body and lives on in some form. So that might be some consciousness, an energy, a life force, a soul, spirit, whatever word you want to call it. But whatever their response to that is, it's their reality and it's their belief. And, in a way, religion is a set of beliefs. No one knows what happens when we die. We're still playing with that. But that concept that they hold supports them, and it generally supports the family who love them and are accompanying them. And they will be able to reference to that. So, for example, often people will say, oh, I'll be part of everything, or I'm going to come back as a butcher bird, which we have here. They're very common, but as some sort of bird, or I'll be a rainbow, or I'll just be hanging around looking out for you. And occasionally people say, nothing. I don't believe in anything. I think my body's going to die and that's it. It's curtains for me. And then whatever the family believe, they have a reality check too. And somewhere that sustains them. And everybody can believe what they want at the moment. It's whatever gets you there. The same as, in that time after death. It's whatever gets you there, just like in taking the treatment for any disease, whether you take a pharmaceutical approach, an interventionist approach, or, some other way of being, not to not have treatment, but to just die as pain-free as possible. Then people who are empowered in that decision-making or those choices, it's very supportive for the people who are left behind.
That's so true. And I think you made a statement that dying well on your own terms is one of the greatest gifts you can give to your loved ones. And that's such a good reminder for people as a reason why they should do their work in advance and prepare for the end of life, because it's a gift to those who will be left behind.
Yeah. It's totally, because we all know it's a shit fight if people are resistant and are unprepared, if they don't do the paperwork, if they don't confront that, if they don't want to discuss it. And it's so painful for families who are with someone who won't let them speak to them as if they are dying, because they're unable to usually convey how much they love that person, and to have that love thwarted by someone because that person, and often they're just, the word denial, I don't use that word, but I see that people are fearful, and sometimes they are unable to process what is happening to them and their response to that. And then some people can process all that, but they don't want to discuss it. It's too painful in their love for those people to be able to have a conversation about what's happening. So sometimes I can bridge that gap by identifying that and saying, is that how it is for you? And they'll just nod, because we all know that it's challenging to articulate how we're feeling, and culturally we're not always encouraged, or we don't learn how to do that well. And sometimes in that death you can see that families are, they're sort of so constricted in their ability to just say what they really feel or what they mean, or to have those courageous conversations with each other. And often I find that that's a role I play, just to open up that conversation by being a third person there, because sometimes the person can speak to you and the other person involved can listen, and they will be able to understand what that person's feeling, but they're not caught in that dynamic, in that relational dynamic that they've had all their lives.
Yes.
So it's a great time. It's your last chance to seize that moment, to be prepared and to be courageous.
And you, as a third party, can ask the questions that need to be asked or that are wanting to be asked, but that no one else quite knows how to bring up and how to say those words.
And what I'm trying to do is come from a place of kindness, and I'm doing for others what I would want someone to do for me. So I have to imagine that I'm that 10-year-old child. I have to imagine that I'm the teenager, disempowered by not a long life experience, or being in a disempowered position as not quite an adult, where all those adults are looking out for those children. But then those children need an advocate to speak on their behalf, and light a torch so that they can get through it, because people are often so very well intentioned, but their picture becomes narrow, and sometimes it's sort of, we have to pull back out and see the big picture, and move from that place. And but asking people that question, I think that was the start of this discussion, really opens that up. And preparing for death, even if you don't, telling people how you feel is the most comforting thing you can do. Even if you're terrified, then people can try and assist you with that terror.
And I know one other thing you mentioned in the TEDx talk is that dying is an inside job, which I love that. I love thinking of it that way, and wondering what tools you would recommend. I mean, besides just filling out our advance directives and making, decisions for our body, are there tools that you use or that you would recommend us that we use now to help us be better prepared on the inside for the end of life?
Well, I think because what I also see is most people's fears or concerns are about control, about being out of control. And most people who are dying from a disease, that disease is out of their control. The situation is out of their control. So the only thing you can work towards having some control over is your own tricky mind. And anybody who does meditation, I'm not a big meditator, I might add, but anybody who does meditation will know that the purpose of that is to try and still the mind and not let it control you. And so I started to understand that the mind needs the body to stay alive, because the mind doesn't have an independent life. Once the body dies, the mind dies, and it's terrified of dying. Because it's the age-old question, who are we? What am I? Who am I? Are we our mind? Are we our personality? Are we our body? Are we, our nervous system, our emotional responses? We're all of those things. We're a complex, amazing thing. But the only thing at the end of the day that will be any value to you is your peace of mind, your peace of heart, your ability to be present in that situation. And if you have people that you love, especially children or a partner that you're leaving behind, then to be able to be present to them in an open, expansive way is one of the greatest gifts you can give them. But it's not about them, because they also have to do their own work. But especially for people who are leaving small children behind, to not die in fear, to be sorry that you're dying, sad that you're dying because you won't see them grow up, but to show them what dying well looks like will sustain them for the rest of their lives. But at the end of the day, it's not about anybody else. It's really about ourselves. And it's the culmination of our whole life experience so far. But anybody who's sat with dying people You can sit with someone who's dying without fear. That's one thing. But once you sit with someone who's dying with grace, and that really is such an incredible lesson, because once you know that's possible, once you see it, once you feel it, then it's a great teaching for that's the way I want to be. I want to be in a calm, present, gracious place as much as possible, because that is such an incredible gift to give to everyone else. But it's the biggest gift to give yourself.
That is so beautiful, the thought of dying with grace. And I can think of a handful of people I've had the privilege of sitting with that I know what you mean by that. It's that experience of dying in that place of being filled with love and open-hearted and without fear, ready to go. Yeah.
And once you've had that experience, you will, once they've shown you a way to go, then I just know that when that comes to me, that's how I want to be. Because I look at the options, they're not very interesting, on an internal level.
Well, Zen, as someone, I would say you've been doing all of this work for such a long time for others, and yet I have no doubt that you've done your inner work as well. And gosh, you are just such a gift to your own community, but also to all the rest of us who get a chance to benefit from your wisdom. And I want to thank you so much for that.
And I also want to say, I don't come alone. I come with all those incredible people that I've worked with, and their families. We all come to offer this. So I'm just sort of a conduit for those people's experiences and everything that they have shared and taught me, which also includes the way not to go. And so if I can be of any service to anyone along with them, because I'm the last one standing, then that's an incredible opportunity because people only need to get one thing. It's an incremental journey. We need to put one foot in front of the other, but we are all walking towards our own death, and we really want to do that the very best we can, so that if we get a chance to look back, we can think, yeah, that was a great life. And if you look forward, you think the people that love me will be supported by the way I've lived and the way I've died.
That's a beautiful statement to end our conversation with, Zen. And I did want to mention that you do in-person trainings, Deathwalker trainings in Australia for anyone who lives there or can get there to take part in your trainings. And I know you mentioned in the future there will be probably something online for training as well. And so is it best to refer people to the website to learn more about your trainings?
Yeah, really my personal website is very non-attended by myself. So I'm putting all my energy into the Natural Death Care Centre, because that is what life is asking me to do, and that's what death is also asking me to do. So any information, you're much better to go to the Natural Death Care Centre, spelled in the non-American way, .org, and check that out. But there are lots of podcasts there, and probably in those podcasts, I probably cover a lot of things that I cover in the training, and people can do that at their own pace and take it in to their capacity.
All right. I will leave a link to the website, but also to your book and the TEDx talk, and also the documentary film, Zen and the Art of Dying. And Zen, I thank you so very much for spending this hour with me. It's been such a privilege to talk with you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Zenith Virago. I loved talking with her. She is so calm and has such deep wisdom to share. It's just really profound to be in her presence and speak with her. And one of the things that was a great reminder for me is the idea of not looking for meaning in everything, which I do that all the time for my own life, but remembering not to look for meaning in other people's experiences, because that's really something unique to us that we each have to work on for ourselves. And that as we work with people at the end of life, we are far better just sitting in the mystery, in the not knowing, and being with people, being still and quiet, and simply allowing them to have their process, whatever it is, and not judging it as good or bad or right or wrong, and not trying to shift their experience in any way, just letting it be whatever it is, and allowing our presence to create a safe space for them in which their own process can unfold. And I think that's really important, because in the death positive movement, I think each of us definitely has ideas about what we think a good death is and what dying well might mean. And really, we've all dedicated ourselves to improve the way people die and to make sure people have a good death, or at least a better death than they might have had before. But it's important at the very same time, as dedicated as we are to this purpose, to free ourselves of all of our attachments and remember that we don't really know what a good death means for any other person. It's really not up to us. And that the very best and most helpful thing we can bring is our calm presence in that situation, and hold space and allow each person to follow their own path and experience whatever is arising for them. So, very good reminder for me. I often, in my own life and in all kinds of things I get involved in, I tend to try to take control, and I'm always trying to anticipate what might go wrong, what could I do to make things better, and exerting my influence and pushing just a little bit to try to make things go the way I think it should go. And it's such a good reminder to me in all of my life to simply sit, be still, and be quiet, and allow things to unfold naturally, and then respond to them as they do unfold in the moment, instead of projecting into the future and trying to control things. So Zenith is just an amazing example of this, of being in the moment, and you can feel it. You can feel her presence when you're with her and speaking with her directly. And I hope that comes across in the recording so you can hear that as well. So I encourage you, look for the links in the show notes for this episode. Take a listen to her TEDx talk. I will link to that on YouTube, and also go to the documentary Zen and the Art of Dying. You can rent it for $4.99, and it would be wonderful to watch with a few other people and to have a discussion around it. And you can also purchase it if you wanted to use it somehow in your work. But I encourage you to take a look at those two things. So thanks for being here today. Always grateful to have an audience listening in to these conversations. If you enjoy this content, please tell other people about it. You can share single episodes or just tell them about the podcast if you think it might be of benefit to them. You can also help out by subscribing wherever you happen to listen, whatever platform you're on, whether it's Apple, Google, Stitcher, Spotify. Subscribe to the podcast and then leave a rating and review, because that really helps this podcast to be shown to more people who are searching for content like this. And I'm putting this out there and doing this work in order to grow this community of people who care about end-of-life issues. So you can help me grow the community just by spreading the word. And thank you. I appreciate that very much. So until next Monday, when I'll be back again with another interview for you, remember that we're here for love. So if you forget everything else, just try to remember love each and every day. And face your fear. be ready for whatever happens next, and love each and every moment of your precious and fleeting life. Bye-bye.